You don't just lose your way in the warp. You lose time, you lose reality, you lose the right to believe that the universe still follows rules. The Cathedral of Iron was supposed to reach Cadia in 3 weeks. Instead, the crew watched each other age and vanish while the ship's corridors bent into shapes that should not exist. When we finally clawed our way back into real space, 9 centuries had passed. Yet somehow, some of us were still inside. I'm going to tell you what it means to be lost. Not lost the way a child disappears in a crowd. Not lost the way a soldier gets separated from his squad in the smoke. I mean lost in the way that unravels the fabric of what you are. Lost where the very idea of direction becomes a cruel joke told by something that has forgotten how to laugh. I am Navigator Adept Relian Vos. I served aboard the Cathedral of Iron for what my chronometer insists was 6 months, and what my bones remember as lifetimes. I record this account not because I believe anyone will hear it, but because shaping words into coherent thought is the last thing that proves I was once human. The Cathedral of Iron was a dictator-class cruiser, 3 kilometers of consecrated steel, with prayers etched into every rivet. She carried 12,000 souls, not counting the servitors, and her mission was mundane by Imperial standards. We were to transport reinforcements and material to the Cadian Gate, a milk run along established warp routes I had navigated 24 times before. I had been with the cathedral for 8 years. I knew her machine spirit's moods, the way her hull sang in the Imperium, the particular flavor of unreality that clung to her corridors after translation. Captain Tovan Helix was a man of rigid faith and military precision, the kind of officer who treated the Lectitio Divinitatus like a tactical manual. His crew feared him appropriately, which is to say they loved him the way one loves a father who has never shown weakness. We entered the warp on schedule. Geller field stable. Plasma drives humming their machine hymns. I settled into my navigation blister, a sphere of crystalline armor jutting from the ship's spine like a blind eye, and opened my third eye to the currents of the Imperium. What I saw was familiar. The cathedral rode the warp like a blade cutting through turbulent water, her shields a bubble of reality forcing back the unreality that pressed from all sides. The Emperor's light, as manifested through our Geller field, kept the nightmares at bay, or so we believed. The first sign as something had gone wrong came early, though later I would learn our chronometers disagreed wildly on how long we had truly been traveling. I was charting routine course corrections when I felt it, a shift in the current, subtle as the change in air pressure before a storm. The warp around us moved differently, not flowing past our reality bubble, but curling around it, tasting it. I've navigated the Imperium for 30 years. I know the difference between ordinary turbulence and attention. I reported the anomaly to Captain Helix immediately. He arrived at my blister within minutes, uniform pressed to parade perfection despite the hour, his face carved from stone. I explained what I had sensed, choosing my words carefully. Navigators do not speak lightly of such things. Captains do not appreciate uncertainty. "Can you correct our course?" he asked. "I can try," I said. "But the warp isn't responding as it should. It's as if the currents themselves are rearranging to match our movements." He stared at me with eyes that had seen Void War and Xeno's horror and never blinked. "Then we proceed with faith," he said. "The Emperor protects." I wanted to tell him faith was a shield, not a map. I held my tongue. I turned back to my charts and began the delicate work of adjusting our trajectory. The cathedral responded to my guidance, her reality drive straining as we angled away from what I perceived as the disturbance. For a time, I believed I had succeeded. The sensation of being watched faded. The warp currents began to feel normal again. Then we hit the divergence. There is no adequate language for what happens when a ship traveling through the Imperium loses its navigational lock. In real space, you can drift and still measure your position. Stars, planets, the galactic plane. In the warp, there is no up or down, no fixed point, no constants. You move through a dimension where thought and emotion have weight, where the laws of physics are polite suggestions at best. When a ship loses its way in that howling madness, it does not simply go off course. It goes off the map entirely, into regions the warp has never charted, because no one who entered ever returned to tell the tale. I felt the divergence like a hook driven into my third eye, yanking us sideways through a dimension that should not have a sideways. The cathedral shuddered, not physically but conceptually, as if the ship itself was uncertain of its own existence for a moment. Alarms screamed throughout the vessel. The Geller field flickered, only an instant, only a heartbeat, but long enough for anyone with a sensitive soul to feel the breath of something vast and hungry pressing against the hull. Captain Helix ordered battle stations, which was the correct response to any crisis, and entirely inadequate for this one. You cannot shoot your way out of being lost. I worked frantically at my charts, searching for any landmark, any current I recognized. But the warp around us had become a featureless expanse of screaming color and malicious geometry. It felt as if we had sailed off the edge of every map at once and found ourselves in a void beneath the void. "Navigator Voss," the captain demanded over the Vox, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Report." "We have diverged from all known routes," I said, and my own voice sounded hollow even to me. "I cannot find our position. The warp here does not match any recorded topology." There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his words were carefully measured. "Can you navigate us back?" "I do not know where back is, Captain," I said. "I do not even know where here is." I heard him breathing over the Vox, wind through a crypt. Then he said, "We will hold course and trust in the Emperor's guidance. Continue monitoring. Report any changes immediately." What else could he say? What else could any of us do? The hours that followed taught me the true meaning of dread. Not fear. Fear is a response to immediate danger. But dread. The slow understanding that you are trapped in a situation with no good outcomes. I remained at my station, my third eye open to the Imperium, watching the nothing around us. The cathedral drifted through the warp like a ghost ship. Engines still firing, but with nowhere to aim. The crew performed their duties with increasing tension. Servitors continued with mechanical indifference, unaware that anything was wrong. The human crew knew better. Temporal anomalies began to manifest. A tech priest reported performing hours of maintenance on a plasma conduit, only to return to his station and find his chronometer advanced by minutes. A deck officer watched a servitor walk the length of a corridor in what appeared to be frozen time, each step taking subjective hours, while the servitor's internal clock registered normal passage. Two armsmen got into a fistfight over a gambling debt. By the time their sergeant arrived to break it up, both men insisted the fight had lasted either seconds or hours, and they could not agree on who threw the first punch. I felt it in my blister as well. I would chart a course correction, blink, and discover I had been staring at the same set of calculations for what my body insisted were days, while my chronometer showed only minutes had passed. Other times, I would begin a notation and finish it before my hand had moved, as if my thoughts were outrunning time itself. The warp was not merely around us anymore. It was bleeding into us, rewriting the rules of causality inside our reality bubble. Captain Helix called an assembly of senior officers in the Strategium. I attended via hololith, unwilling to leave my station even briefly. The other officers looked haggard, uniforms disheveled, eyes carrying the particular hollowness that comes from too many hours without real sleep. The captain himself looked as pressed and perfect as ever, but I could see it. The tremor in his jaw, the tightness around his eyes. He stated the official time we had been in the warp, and I watched several officers glance at one another with expressions that suggested their personal experience did not match his certainty. He spoke of temporal displacement, the Mechanicus term for what was happening. A known phenomenon in uncharted warp regions, he said. Unsettling, but not immediately lethal. He emphasized discipline, faith, duty, orders to report anomalies, tech priests to monitor the Geller field and ship systems with increased vigilance. I would continue searching for a route home. It was a good speech, calm and confident, exactly what the crew needed to hear. It was also a mission-shaped lie. What he did not say was that we had no idea how to escape, that the anomalies would worsen, that the longer we remained in this region, the more the warp would seep into the ship's reality. After the assembly, the captain contacted me privately. "Tell me the truth, Navigator. What is our situation?" I looked at him through the hololith projection, this man who had commanded through void battles and boarding actions with perfect composure. And I told him what I believed. "We are adrift in a region of the warp that should not exist," I said, "or perhaps exists only because we are observing it. The Imperium is not passive here. It is responding to us, possibly shaping itself around our presence. The temporal distortions will worsen," I continued. "Eventually the crew will experience more severe displacement. Days passing in minutes, years passing in hours, or the reverse. Subjective time will diverge so severely that communication becomes impossible. A man will age to death in what feels like decades, while his chronometer shows a day has passed," I said, "or he will experience a single second stretched across what his mind perceives as an eternity." His face remained stone, but I saw his hands clench. "And the Geller field?" he demanded. "It is holding," I said, "but it is designed to maintain real space physics within its boundary. If time itself becomes unstable, I do not know if it can compensate. We may be protected from demonic incursion and still be vulnerable to chronological dissolution." "Speak plainly. We may die of old age in minutes, Captain," I said, "or be trapped in an eternal moment. Conscious, unable to move, unable to think in any way that matters. Or we may simply cease to exist in any meaningful sense," I added. "Our molecules scattered across temporal dimensions we cannot perceive." He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something he already suspected. "Then we pray," he said, "and we work. Find me a way home, Navigator Voss. That is an order." I wanted to tell him some situations were beyond orders, beyond duty, beyond even faith. Instead, I nodded and returned my attention to the warp. The days continued. Or perhaps they did not continue at all, but repeated in variations, like music played by an instrument that has forgotten its tuning. I charted the nothing around us and found patterns that made no sense. Currents flowing backward, eddies of calm inside screaming void. Once I thought I saw something massive moving in the distance, a shape so large it took time for my perception to register it as a shape at all. But when I focused my third eye upon it, there was only chaos. The crew began to fracture. Not in discipline, Captain Helix maintained that with iron will, but in shared reality. Groups of workers would report completing the same task, yet describe it happening in different ways, in different orders, sometimes with different people present. A meal in the galley would be remembered by some as breakfast and by others as dinner, and a glance at chronometers could be made to support both memories depending on whose hand held the device. Entire shifts would pass in what felt like moments or stretch into subjective eternities. Stories filtered up through the chain of command. An engine seer worked for what he experienced as months without stopping, maintaining the plasma drives through exhaustion that should have killed him, only to discover that, by ship time, only hours had passed and his body showed no signs of the ordeal. A squad of armsmen stood guard at a bulkhead door and experienced nothing for what their chronometers claimed was an ordinary watch. But all shared the same hallucination, decades at their post, growing old where they stood, watching each other's hair gray and skin wrinkle, seeing companions die of age while they remained unable to move or call for help, trapped in bodies that aged in the mind but not in the flesh. A young rating came to the chapel and told the priest she had lived an entire life between two heartbeats, married, had children, grew old, died, then woke still standing in the corridor mid-step. The priest gave her the Emperor's blessing and assigned her to lighter duties, but I saw her eyes. She was not entirely present anymore. Part of her was still living that other life, shadow existence clinging to her like a second skin. The captain continued to maintain order through force of will and faith. He conducted daily prayers over the Vox, his voice steady and certain, reciting litanies of protection and endurance. The crew responded as best they could, though their voices lacked conviction. You can only pray for deliverance so long before the words begin to ring hollow. I worked without rest. Or perhaps I rested constantly and only thought I was working. Time had become so subjective that I could no longer trust my own experience. I charted and recharted the warp around us, searching for any weakness, any thinning of the barrier between Imperium and Materium that might indicate proximity to real space. I found nothing. Or rather, I found everything and nothing simultaneously. Navigational data in a quantum state, refusing to resolve into anything useful. Then the Geller field began to flicker with regularity. The fluctuations were brief, mere microseconds, but they increased, and each time the field wavered, the ship's reality wavered with it. Colors shifted into spectrums human eyes were never meant to perceive. Sounds became tactile. The scent of incense arrived before the chapel censers were lit. Servitors froze mid-motion, their logic engines unable to process contradictory sensory input, and tech priests had to manually reset them while struggling to maintain coherent thought themselves. I reported this to Captain Helix with appropriate gravity. The Geller field is not failing in a technical sense, I explained. The generators function within parameters, but the field is designed to create a bubble of real space normal inside the warp. Here, where time and space are already compromised, it cannot establish what qualifies as normal. It is trying to maintain consistency in an environment with no consistent state to maintain. What does that mean for us? He asked. It means the boundary between us and the warp is becoming theoretical rather than absolute, I said. We are still protected from direct incursion, but the line between inside and outside is blurring. The ship itself may begin to experience dimensional instability. As if to punctuate my words, the deck beneath my feet rippled like water, not violently, but unmistakably. Metal flowed in a wave from bow to stern, solid matter behaving like liquid for a moment before resolving back into steel. My stomach lurched, not from motion, but from the existential wrongness of matter forgetting what it was supposed to be. "Throne preserve us," the captain whispered. It was the first time I'd ever heard anything like fear in his voice. The dimensional instabilities began small. Then they grew rapidly. Corridors extended or contracted. Not smoothly, but in jerks and stutters, as if space itself was struggling to maintain consistent dimensions. A passage that should have been short would stretch impossibly long, snap back to almost nothing, then settle again while crew were trying to walk through it. Several ratings suffered severe disorientation and had to be sedated. One unfortunate armsman was caught inside a corridor when it contracted, compressed into a space that should not have been able to contain a human body. He survived, screaming, bones broken in patterns that suggested he had been folded through dimensions orthogonal to the standard 3. Medici staff did what they could. No manual contained treatment for spatial compression trauma. The ship's geometry began to lie. Doors opened onto rooms that could not possibly fit inside the hull. A storage locker contained an expanse larger than the deck surrounding it. Mapping servitors became useless, their programming unable to reconcile contradictory data, corridors connecting in ways that violated basic topology. Crew reported walking in circles and arriving at their destination, or traveling straight and ending up behind where they started. I remained in my navigation blister, afraid to leave it, afraid that if I stepped out, I would be unable to find my way back. My space was small and cramped, lined with the instruments of my trade and the protective wards that kept my mutant third eye from drawing unwanted attention from the warp. Here, at least, I still had something that resembled a fixed point, and even that was beginning to feel like a lie. Here, at least, reality held together. Inside my navigation blister, the walls still behaved like walls. The floor remembered how to be solid. I could still think in straight lines, most of the time. But even here, I was not safe. The warp had learned to leak through seams that no sealant could touch. I began to see things at the edge of my vision. Not diamonds, not the classic masks of the Imperium. Something worse, because it wore the skin of the familiar. Fragments of the ship. Echoes, repetitions. I would glance at my instruments and see them from angles that should not exist, as if I were observing the same space from multiple perspectives at once. Like the blister had become a crystal with too many faces, and my mind was sliding across them. Once I saw myself at my station. I saw the back of my own head, shoulders hunched, hands moving through calculations with practiced precision. For one perfect, impossible instant, I watched myself working as if I were standing behind me. I turned. There was nothing but the curved wall of my blister. No shadow. No reflection. No second presence. Yet the image remained in my memory with perfect clarity, like a brand pressed into wax. Reality insisted it had never happened. My mind insisted it had. That was the pattern aboard the cathedral. Now, memory and matter arguing over what was true. The crew's mental state deteriorated as the ship's physical stability unraveled. Daily prayer services, once the only rhythm that mattered, became chaotic. Different sections of the ship heard different words from the captain's Vox sermons. Some heard the lines in different orders. Some heard the same phrase repeated until it lost meaning and became raw sound. A few stopped attending altogether. They claimed the entire service happened in a single instant, every word arriving simultaneously, slamming into their minds at once. Too much meaning for a human brain to process. Others swore the services lasted for days. They described Helix's voice droning without pause, each litany looping back into itself until they thought they would go mad from repetition. And people began to fight over things no longer anchored in a shared timeline. 2 tech priests came to blows over whether a particular rite had been performed. Each was absolutely certain. Each believed the other was lying or insane. I suspected the truth was more corrosive than either explanation. Both were correct within their own experience. The ship's fractured time had allowed them to live different versions of the same event. There was no objective truth anymore, only competing narratives held together by sheer stubbornness. Captain Helix responded the only way he knew. He tightened discipline. He instituted curfews, even though time-based restrictions were nearly meaningless when time itself refused to behave. He increased patrols, even though armsmen often got lost in corridors that changed while they walked, and had to be guided back by servitors, machines whose internal maps remained consistent even when the ship did not. He ordered public punishments for lapses in discipline. Floggings, confinements, displays meant to remind the crew that some laws were still absolute. I thought it was a mistake. Fear does not build unity. It corrodes it, but I understood his reasoning. He needed the crew to believe in something unchanging. If physics would not cooperate, then the law of the Imperial Navy would have to serve as the last remaining constant. While Helix tried to force order onto the crew, I stayed in my blister and did the only work left that felt remotely real. I opened to the warp again and again, searching for any weakness that might lead us out, any thin place where the boundary between Materium and Immaterium might be less hostile. And slowly, gradually, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The warp around us was not random. The chaos had patterns, subtle, complex, but undeniable. It was as if the Immaterium was arranging itself in response to us, not merely reacting after the fact, anticipating. The currents of unreality flowed in ways that felt almost intentional. Eddies formed where we would move, not where we had moved. Vortices gathered as if preparing a path before we chose one. I began to test the idea. I requested minor course adjustments from the helmsman, small changes, nothing dramatic, and watched what the warp did. Each time we altered direction, the surrounding space shifted to accommodate us, or to injure us. It guided us into channels I had not selected. It offered smooth water and then, without warning, turned it into undertow. The effect was subtle enough that I had missed it before. But once I knew what to look for, the evidence became impossible to deny. The warp was learning us. I reported it to Captain Helix, and for the first time I saw his facade crack. "What does that mean?" he demanded. "Is there an intelligence directing this? A demon?" "I do not believe so," I said carefully, trying to translate an intuition into words sturdy enough to survive scrutiny. "If it were a demon, we would see other signs. Possession, corruption, direct psychic assault." "This is something else," I continued. "The warp is not static. It is the realm of thought and emotion given form. Our fear, our confusion, our desperate hope. Those things are bleeding into the surrounding space. The Imperium is absorbing them," I said, "and shaping itself in response. We are not being hunted. We are being reflected." Helix stared at me as if I had blasphemed with calm logic. "Then how do we escape our own reflection?" he asked. I had no answer. Over what might have been days or weeks or a handful of minutes stretched into suffering, the truth grew clearer. The Cathedral of Iron was no longer merely a ship lost in the warp. She was becoming part of it. The machine spirits, those fragmentary echoes of intelligence that haunt every Imperial vessel, began to change. Tech priests reported anomalies that defied their most sacred diagnostics. Systems responding to commands before they were given, auto-rights activating in anticipation of needs not yet spoken aloud. The plasma drives began to hum prayers that were not in their programming, litanies in languages the Mechanicus did not recognize. I heard one through the Vox, by accident or design. It was not Gothic, not lingua technis, not any consecrated machine tongue. It was something older, or newer, or outside the idea of before and after entirely. The words bypassed my ears and spoke directly into my mind. Meaning without language, intent without grammar. They carried hunger and patience, the pleasure of consumption spread across eternities. Waiting, becoming, the joy of being many and one. Peace through dissolution. I severed the Vox connection and reported it immediately. Helix ordered purges, cleansings, extensive rites performed with desperate fervor, incense and sacred oils, chanted prayers pumped into the ship's vital systems like blood. But I saw it in the tech priests' faces and in the trembling of their hands over their data slates. The cleansings were not entirely successful. The machine spirits had been touched by something they could not simply scrub away. And then the ship began to change in ways that could not be filed under malfunction. Corridors that had been shifting and unstable began to settle into new configurations. Stable, yes, but architecturally impossible. Passageways curved through spaces that should have been occupied by other rooms. Support struts angled through bulkheads without connection, like bones rearranged under skin. The crew stopped trusting maps. They navigated by memory and landmark, carving mental paths through a geography that defied documentation. Stranger still were the new spaces that began to appear. Rooms no one had ordered built, chambers blooming where sensors showed only void or structural supports. A ratings crew sent to investigate one such anomaly returned pale and shaking. They had found a chamber the size of a cathedral. Its walls were lined with statues of weeping angels, faces that shifted between human and something else when observed indirectly, as if your peripheral vision saw the truth and your direct gaze was politely lied to. That chamber should not have fit within the ship's hull, and yet it was there, solid, real, wrong. Helix ordered it sealed. It was sealed. More appeared anyway. And at last I understood what was happening. The Cathedral of Iron was being rebuilt by the warp, reshaped into a configuration that reflected our collective unconscious as much as our physical structure. Every fear, every hope, every desperate prayer was being absorbed by the Imperium and written back onto the ship's substance. We were not merely experiencing the warp. We were becoming part of it, a vessel existing in both real space and the Imperium simultaneously. The implications were terrifying. If the ship continued to change, would she remain a ship in any meaningful sense? Would the crew remain human? Or would we become creatures of thought and nightmare? Minds that remembered individuality but could no longer sustain it. How long before the boundaries between self and other dissolved completely, and we merged into some mass consciousness that still wore our names like old uniforms? I tried to explain this to Captain Helix. He refused to accept it. "We are servants of the Emperor," he said, voice hard with absolute faith. "We are protected by his will and the strength of our souls. The warp cannot claim us so long as we remain faithful. Faith is not armor against this," I said, perhaps too bluntly. "The warp does not care what we believe. It is beyond morality, beyond judgment. It simply is, and we are in it, and it is changing us whether we consent or not." His hand moved to his sidearm. For a moment I thought he might shoot me for heresy. Instead, he spoke very quietly. "Then we maintain our humanity through discipline and duty. We do not surrender to despair. We continue to search for a way home. Is that clear, Navigator?" "Yes, Captain," I said, because what else could I say? But I knew, with the certainty that comes from decades of reading the warp's moods, that faith and discipline would not be enough. We were drowning in unreality, and every struggle only pulled us deeper. The psychological toll became unbearable for some. 3 ratings committed suicide in what the ship's official time called a single day, though even that phrase felt meaningless now. Each death was wrong. One stepped into a corridor and simply stopped existing. His body was found later in a section of the ship he could not possibly have reached between disappearance and discovery. Another hanged himself in his quarters, but when the body was cut down, it crumbled to dust, as if dead for centuries rather than hours. The third walked into the primary plasma reactor and was instantly vaporized. And yet several crew reported seeing her afterward, walking the corridors for what they insisted were weeks. A ghost, an echo, a fragment of consciousness that refused to accept death as an ending. Those suicides did more damage to morale than any spatial anomaly. Death was supposed to be final. Death was supposed to make sense. To see it twisted like everything else aboard the cathedral drove home the message we had all been avoiding. We had entered a realm where even death offered no certain escape. Helix ordered increased surveillance, daily psychological evaluations for all crew, but the Medicae staff were struggling to remain coherent themselves. How do you measure sanity when reality is insane? What baseline do you apply when time splinters and geometry lies? From my blister, I watched the Cathedral of Iron descend into functional madness, and still the crew worked. Duty became the only anchor left, the only thing that felt real in a ship that had become a fever dream. They cleaned corridors that rearranged themselves overnight. They maintained systems that obeyed different physics depending on who observed them. They stood watch at posts that moved when no one was looking. They did it with a grim determination that was either the highest expression of human will or the deepest delusion. I admired them in a distant way. I was isolated in my blister, alone with my instruments and my constantly open third eye, watching the warp coil around us like a serpent that has already swallowed its prey and is slowly digesting it. At least the crew had each other. They could share their madness, compare experiences, confirm they were not entirely alone. I had only myself, and increasingly, I was not certain myself was a unified concept anymore. Under normal circumstances, the worst part of navigating the warp is vigilance. You cannot let your guard down for even a moment. The Imperium is always probing, always seeking weakness. But here, in this uncharted abyss, the warp did not need to seek. It was already inside, woven into the ship's fabric, whispering through our own machine spirits, reflecting our fears back at us in physical form. So I maintained my focus not to guide us home, but to keep my identity from dissolving into the surrounding chaos. And then, at last, I saw what we had become. I opened my third eye and perceived a vessel moving through the turbulence near us. At first, the image wavered, uncertain, like a thought that couldn't decide whether to be real. Then it snapped into clarity. A ship 3 kilometers long, dictator class, every detail precise and perfect. the Cathedral of Iron. But we were the Cathedral of Iron. I stared at this impossible twin, this reflection that should not exist, and understanding crept into my mind like ice water. The warp had not only absorbed our fear and reshaped our ship. It had created a duplicate, a mirror, a predatory echo born from our collective consciousness. And as I watched, the phantom cathedral altered course, angling toward us with unmistakable intention. I called Captain Helix immediately. "We have a situation," I said. "There is another ship approaching. It appears to be the Cathedral of Iron." The silence on the Vox lasted too long. Then Helix spoke, clipped and dangerous. "Explain." I searched for words that would not sound like madness. "The warp has generated a construct based on our vessel," I said. "It is mimicking us, down to hull markings and armor patterns. I believe it is what I have been sensing. The intelligence I suspected is not separate from us." "It is us," I said, "or rather a version of us the warp has shaped from our psychic presence." "Is it hostile?" Helix demanded. "I do not know," I admitted, "but it is approaching with clear purpose. Captain, I recommend we alter course immediately." "To where?" he asked, and the hopelessness in that question spoke volumes. "Where do you flee when you are lost in an infinite sea of madness?" "Anywhere but here," I said. Helix gave the order. The cathedral shifted course, reality drive straining as the helmsman dragged our ship through impossible current. The Phantom matched us perfectly. It anticipated every change in direction as if it had already lived them. Because it had. It was learning from us because it was made of us, born from the same fear and desperation we carried like fuel. We could not outmaneuver our own reflection. As it closed the distance, I felt something close to resignation. We had been fighting the warp with reason, with faith, with discipline. But you cannot fight your own shadow. You cannot navigate away from something that exists as an expression of your existence. The Phantom Cathedral pulled alongside us, near enough that I could see details of its hull. Perfect, mirror image, and yet wrong in a way I could not fully name. The proportions were correct, but the essence was alien, like a flawless painting that fails to capture life. A ship shaped by minds that copied form without understanding function. Then it opened fire. The impact was not physical. There was no breach, no decompression, no clean casualties from weapons. Instead, it attacked us with unreality itself. From where its lance batteries should have been, it projected beams of condensed warp force that passed through our Geller field without resistance and struck the ship's interior spaces directly. Corridors hit by those beams stopped obeying consistent rules. Gravity reversed or multiplied. Time fragmented into parallel streams. Crew caught in those zones experienced instant divergence, timelines splitting into countless possibilities, all occurring at once. I witnessed one strike near engineering through internal sensors. An entire section of the vessel experienced every possible outcome of its existence simultaneously. The crew there lived and died, and never existed in the same moment. Some aged to dust in an instant. Others became children. Minds intact, bodies regressed, screaming with adult terror through young lungs. One tech priest unfolded into a higher dimensional shape. His three-dimensional body revealed as a cross-section of something larger and more terrible. The cathedral shuddered under the assault, not from damage to steel, but from existential uncertainty. The machine spirits screamed in binary and sacred language, prayers becoming pleas for identity, for confirmation that they were still what they had been. The lights flickered between spectrums and settled on colors that hurt to perceive. The air tasted of copper and rust and something sweet like decay. Helix ordered return fire. The gunnery crews obeyed because obedience was the last law left. But our weapons were built for real space. Macro cannon shells vanished into the warp between our hull and the Phantom as if swallowed. Lance beams carved brilliant lines the duplicate absorbed without effect. We might as well have been shooting at a mirror with bullets made of light. The Phantom Cathedral continued its assault, methodically striking different sections of our ship. Each impact created zones of unreality that spread like infection, corrupting the consistency of space and time around them. The crew began to fragment, not just in time, but narratively. Each person experienced their own version of events with less and less overlap. Communication became nearly impossible when no two witnesses could agree on what had happened, was happening, or would happen next. I remained in my navigation blister, protected, if that word still meant anything, by sheer concentration and the wards that had guarded my third eye for decades. From here, I could see both ships at once, the real and the reflection. And at last I understood something crucial. The Phantom was not separate from us. It was not an enemy in any traditional sense. It was a tumor. A growth spawned from our psychic presence in the warp. And like a tumor, it was killing us not through hatred, but through uncontrolled replication, copying what we were until nothing coherent remained. A thought took shape in my mind. Terrible, desperate, and so clear it felt like it had been waiting for me all along. If the Phantom Cathedral was born from our collective consciousness, then perhaps it could be harmed by that same force. Not with macro cannons, not with lances, not with prayers shouted into a vox that no longer carried consistent meaning. With will. If I could reach into the warp, not as a navigator pleading for a safe channel, but as a psychic blade, an active force shaping the Imperium instead of being shaped by it, then I might be able to touch the Phantom at its source, change it, unravel it, dissolve it back into formless noise. The price would be extreme. Opening myself to the warp without the protection of distance and discipline would leave me exposed to every horror the Imperium contained. And to influence something as vast as a ship-shaped construct, condensed psychic mass given structure by fear, would require more than skill. It would require everything I was. I would have to become the bridge between the real cathedral and its reflection. My mind would be the battlefield where the two would merge or destroy each other. Even if I succeeded, the feedback would burn my consciousness out like a candle held to a furnace. I would not survive it. But if I did nothing, the Cathedral of Iron would be torn apart by unreality. The crew would be scattered across temporal streams like debris from an explosion, each mind trapped alone in its own private hell, unable to share even the mercy of a common ending. So I contacted Captain Helix on a private channel. "I believe I can stop the Phantom Cathedral," I told him, "but the process will kill me, and I cannot guarantee it will work." His reply came after a brief pause, his voice tight as wire. "Explain your plan." I did. I told him I would have to drop every psychic defense I'd built over decades, that I would have to open my third eye fully and reach into the warp with my entire consciousness exposed, that I would attempt to merge my awareness with the Phantom and unmake it from within, collapse its structure by denying it the coherent identity it needed to exist. I did not soften the truth. The shock would almost certainly destroy my mind, leaving my body alive but empty. A breathing shell, a human shape without a human inside. When I finished, silence stretched between us. Then Helix spoke, quieter. "Are you certain this will work?" "No," I said, "but I am certain that doing nothing will end in our total destruction. This offers a chance. Nothing else does." Another pause. Then, "You have my authorization, Navigator Voss. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects." I repeated automatically, though the words landed inside me like ash. I began preparations at once. I dismissed my assistant, a young woman who had served me faithfully through this entire nightmare, and sealed the navigation blister from the inside. I spoke a final prayer to the Emperor, not because I believed he would save me, but because ritual is a kind of scaffolding, and I wanted to face death with something that resembled dignity. Then I opened my third eye fully. Every defense fell away, and I reached into the warp with my naked mind. The pain was immediate and absolute. Not physical pain, though my body reacted as if every nerve were on fire, but the pain of exposure, the pain of a mind designed for limited perception being forced to process the infinite. The warp poured into me. A flood of sensation and emotion and thought with no owner. Pure experience without context, without meaning, without mercy. I felt hatred from things that had never lived but remembered dying. I felt love from entities whose affection was corrosive. I felt the laughter of madness, the weeping of stones, the hunger of the void itself. Through that chaos, I pushed my awareness toward the phantom. I felt it like a tumor in my perception, a wrongness that called to me because it was made from me, from all of us, from every prayer and terror we had bled into the Imperium. Sir, it had our shape, but none of our purpose. A ship without crew, without mission, without meaning, only mimicry. I drove my consciousness into its core and began the work. I attacked its foundations, the conceptual pillars that allowed it to hold form. I denied it, rejected it. I poured my entire identity into the act of unmaking, insisting with the force of my will that this thing had never been, could never be, was nothing but a bad dream that would dissolve the moment waking returned. The phantom cathedral resisted. It had been born from collective consciousness, and it defended itself with the same force. It pressed back against me like a psychic weight meant to crush my awareness into nothing. We grappled in a space beyond space, two competing versions of reality fighting for dominance. And I felt myself begin to fragment. My identity splintered into pieces as I struggled to hold coherent thought against dissolution. Memories broke apart. The sensation of I became thin, stretched, unreliable. But I had one advantage. I was willing to die. The phantom, born from our fear of death, clung to existence with desperate intensity. It wanted to be real more than anything. That desire was its weakness, a crack in its perfect imitation. I exploited it ruthlessly. I offered it false hope and tore it away. I fed its certainty and replaced it with doubt. I undermined the story it told itself, that it was a ship, that it was whole, that it deserved to endure. Slowly, incrementally, I felt it begin to collapse. Its perfect mimicry degraded into approximation, then into distortion, then into formless chaos. The attacks on our ship ceased as the construct lost the ability to project organized force. The mirror image in the warp began to fade, dissolving back into the raw stuff of unreality from which it had been shaped. I would have felt triumph if I still had the machinery for emotion. But by then, I was barely a consciousness, only a function, a process, a denial given temporary agency. I watched the phantom die with the detachment of a mathematician watching an equation resolve. And then the feedback hit. When the phantom cathedral collapsed, all the psychic energy that had gone into its creation had to go somewhere. It rushed back along the connection I had forged, a tsunami of unstructured warp force slamming into my exposed mind with the force of a supernova. I felt my consciousness shatter like glass. Thoughts fragmented into millions of pieces that could never be reassembled into anything resembling Reliant Voss. My last coherent thought was a small prayer that the cathedral would survive, that my sacrifice would mean something. Then there was pain. Then not even pain. Only vast emptiness where identity used to be. I do not remember what happened next. According to the ship's logs, records I later reviewed, my body remained alive in the navigation blister for hours afterward. Breathing, convulsing, bleeding from eyes and nose and ears, but showing no sign of consciousness. The phantom cathedral vanished from all senses and psychic detection, leaving only the real vessel adrift in the warp. Captain Helix ordered emergency rites of mental restoration, but the ship's psychers were unanimous. My consciousness was gone beyond recovery, scattered across the Imperium like ash in a storm. What I do remember is the slow, agonizing process of gathering myself. It was not like waking from sleep. It was like being dead. And then gradually, particle by particle, remembering what it meant to exist. At first I had no body, only awareness, fragments of memory floating in darkness. I did not know who I was or why I was. Perception without perceiver, thought without thinker. Over a span that felt like years, though it might have been seconds, I began to coalesce. Memories returned at random, disconnected, like shards of a broken mirror laid out on a table. My name, the ship, the choice I had made, the thing I had unmade. But the memory felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. When I finally opened my physical eyes, I was no longer in my blister. I was in the Medici ward, restrained to a bed, monitoring lines and sanctified instruments attached to every part of my body. A Medici officer noticed my awareness return and began checking vitals, speaking words that took too long to assemble into meaning. Later, much later, when speech returned, I learned what had happened. The destruction of the Phantom Cathedral had disrupted the local warp currents like a stone thrown into still water. That disruption revealed something my sacrifice had uncovered by accident. A thin place in the boundary between materium and immaterium. A weakness in the warp that suggested proximity to real space. Captain Helix recognized the opportunity instantly. While I lay catatonic, he ordered the ship toward that weakness, gambling everything on one desperate push. The Cathedral of Iron. Battered, transformed, haunted by her time in the warp, broke through into real space like a drowning man breaking the surface. We escaped. But escape is a relative term. When I was finally well enough to review our situation, I learned the cost. The official records said we had been in the warp for 6 months, but when we emerged, we had arrived 940 years after our departure date and 3,000 light-years from our intended destination. The Cadian Gate had fallen centuries ago. The galaxy we returned to had been reshaped by wars and catastrophes we never witnessed, histories written without us. Of the 12,000 souls who entered the warp aboard the Cathedral of Iron, fewer than 3,000 emerged with their minds intact. The rest were killed by temporal anomalies, driven mad by spatial distortions, or simply lost. Fragmented across realities that never agreed to share them, bodies were found throughout the ship in states that mocked understanding. Some freshly dead, some mummified by centuries, others preserved or ruined in ways no Medici text could categorize. And the ship herself bore scars that could not be repaired with steel alone. Entire sections remained dimensionally unstable. Corridors still flickered between configurations. Rooms existed that were larger on the inside than the hull should allow. The tech priests declared huge portions permanently off-limits, sealing them behind blessed bulkheads and warning sigils. The machine spirits still served, but they served in ways that were not entirely predictable or entirely safe. Captain Helix survived, but he was not the same man who had ordered us into the warp 1,000 years earlier. He had aged decades within months of subjective time. His hair had gone white. His face carried lines carved by stress beyond human tolerance. His faith remained, but it had changed into something harder, sharper. Faith not as comfort, but as a weapon pressed to the throat of the void. As for me, I recovered enough to be called conscious, but I was never whole again. My third eye, exposed to raw warp without protection, had been permanently altered. I could no longer navigate in any traditional sense. The Imperium was too loud, too present, always pressing against the edges of my mind, always whispering. I saw things that were not there, or perhaps things that were there, and simply should not have been visible. The tech priests fitted me with psychic dampeners and prescribed medications that dulled perception, but nothing could fully silence the whispers. I was relieved of my duties as navigator adept, honorably. But honor is a small thing when you can barely remember your own name some days. The Imperium recognized my sacrifice, commendations, pensions, words carved into documents. They meant nothing. I was assigned light duty, cataloging warp charts, teaching novice navigators the basics of psychic shielding. Meaningless work, yet it kept me anchored to something that resembled purpose. The Cathedral of Iron continued in service for decades after our emergence. She was rebuilt, reconsecrated, her tainted sections excised and replaced. But those who served aboard her later reported the same strange residue. Voices in corridors speaking dead languages, shadows moving against the light, rooms that appeared only to certain people at certain times. The ship remembered, and in the Imperium, memory has weight. Eventually, the cathedral was retired from active service and declared a reliquary vessel. Her hull was blessed. Her interior was converted into a shrine to the dead. She orbits a shrine world now, a monument to sacrifice, faith, and the price of being lost. I think about that voyage every day, especially in the moments when my medications wear thin and the warp presses close again. I think about the crew who died in ways that made no sense, deaths stretched across subjective eternities or compressed into instants. I think about the phantom cathedral born from our fear and destroyed by my mind. I think about Captain Helix, how his absolute faith kept the crew functioning even when reality itself broke apart. But mostly, I think about what it means to be lost. Not lost in a simple way. Lost in the sense that all references cease to exist. All maps become useless. All directions lead nowhere. To be lost in the warp is to be lost from meaning itself. To exist where existence is negotiable and identity is temporary. We escaped, but we brought something back with us. All of us who survived carry the warp inside us now, a shadow of unreality that never quite leaves. We see patterns that should not exist. We remember events that never happened alongside the ones that did. Our memories are as fractured as the ship's geometry became during that voyage. The Imperium calls us survivors. But survival is a strange word for what happened. We did not survive the warp. We passed through it, and it passed through us. And what emerged on the other side was something wearing our names and faces, but not entirely what it entered. We are changed things, transformed by exposure to unreality, and we will never be whole again. I record this because someone should understand what happened. The official records are sanitized, reduced to tactical data and casualty reports. They do not capture the true horror of drifting in a realm where time and space are provisional and identity is negotiable. They do not explain what it means to watch your ship become a reflection of your darkest fears, or to sacrifice your mind to save your comrades from an enemy born from their own consciousness. The warp is not hell. Hell has rules, boundaries, a kind of cosmic justice, even if it is cruel. The warp is beyond such concepts. It is where meaning goes to die, where all stories become possible, and therefore none are true. To be lost, there is to be cast out of the narrative of reality itself, into a place where you can be anything, and therefore are nothing. I survived, but I am not grateful for survival. I am simply here, existing in the ruins of what I was, forming these words because coherent thought is the only thing that reminds me I once had a self to lose. And sometimes, in the depths of night when medication fails and my third eye opens unbidden, I see the Cathedral of Iron as she was in the warp. Not the physical vessel, but the idea of the vessel. The concept given form by our collective will to survive. I see her sailing through impossible geometries, her hull singing prayers in languages older than human speech, her corridors endless, her cargo the souls of the lost. I see her, and I wonder if we truly escaped at all, or if we are still there, still adrift, still dying across infinite timelines, while some fragment of us exists here in real space, dreaming of salvation that will never come. The warp does not release its prey easily. Those who enter its depths are marked forever. We carry it with us, a stain on the soul no amount of faith or penance can erase. We are survivors of being lost, and that survival is its own form of damnation. This is what happens when an Imperial ship is lost in the warp. This is the price of divergence. This is the cost of being nowhere. When nowhere is everywhere, and everywhere is nothing at all. I am Navigator Adept Reliant Voss, and I have told you the truth of the Cathedral of Iron. Remember it when you next enter the warp. Remember it when the currents shift and the way forward becomes uncertain. Remember that being lost is not a simple thing. And remember that some ships that emerge from the Imperium do so only in body, their souls left behind in the screaming void. Remember and pray you never experience it